He talks about oppressive reality. The first point is that reality. When Freire uses his term reality, reality for Freire does not imply objective reality, right? It's not me ripping this paper in two, right? When we're talking about objective reality, we recognize now that if we're talking about objective reality as the only reality, we recognize that we result in objectivism, which I put before. And a problem with objectivism is that we lose people. We keep stuff, but we lose people. Freire wants to preserve people. So we need to incorporate some aspects, some elements of the subjective, right? The next point is that reality implies the dialectical relationship between subjective and objective realities, right? So that when we're talking about reality for Freire, we're talking about a dialectical relationship between the subject and the object. The question is, why are we talking about the dialectical relationship between the subject and the object? The answer, as we've seen, is that Freire wants to preserve the subject, right, in an objective critique. He doesn't want to lose the subject in an objective critique, and he doesn't want to lose the object in a solipsistic critique. He wants to preserve both the subject and the object. So we can't assume subjectivism and we can't assume solipsism, right? What we have then is a dialectical relationship between subject and object, and in this way, Freire will be able to preserve both the individual and the external world. Oppressive reality is an oppression born out of the contradistinction between oppressor and oppressed, as mutual conditions for the existence of the other. What we recognize then is, insofar as we're talking about the oppressor, which is labeled 1, and the oppressed, which is labeled 2, it's this relationship, right? The oppressor-oppressed relationship is similar to the relationship between the object and the subject, right? It's the similar relationship. If we're talking about the oppressor is only understood in terms of his ability to oppress a subordinate population. You can't properly be said to be an oppressor unless there is a group that is subordinated by your power. You can't properly be said to be an oppressed group unless there is someone who is willfully, deliberately subordinating you. So that the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed isn't a mutually exclusive relationship. It's not like oppressor on the one hand and oppressed group on the other. As it is, we need to recognize that we're all basically in the same process. The way that we move from this distinction in sets, right, the distinction between the oppressor class and the oppressed class, is by recognizing that liberation is a consequence of both the oppressor and the oppressed, right? Only through a recognition of the oppressor and oppressed can we come to a recognition that this is how we liberate ourselves, right? I have to recognize that I no longer need to justify who I am, to rationalize who I am through this paternalistic relationship between myself and the oppressed group. And also, I need to recognize as an oppressed group that I no longer need to oppress members of my own population, right? And that's how we come about a sense of liberation. He has a great line in the text which I think is important. He says, Freire says, something to the effect of, oppression is domestication. Later I'll talk a little bit more about this, but you can think about the domestication of a wild dog, right? If I happen to live on an open range, an open prairie, and I see wild dogs running around, and I decide to bring that wild dog into my home, in a sense what I need to do is oppress that dog from what that dog really is, right? That dog is wild by nature. What I need to do is I need to create a condition wherein the dog recognizes that his sustenance, right, his ability to live, is now contingent on my provision. Insofar as he receives provision, he no longer has to be wild. That's the whole point of domestication, right? He receives provision from the oppressor. So you don't have to be wild. You don't have to run around and fend for yourself. But what do you end up losing as a consequence? You end up losing your freedom. You end up losing the ability to run around and be free. So the benefit, quote unquote, the benefit of subjugating oneself to oppression is the provision by the oppressor. However, obviously the problem is that you lose the freedom that you once had, and now your provisions are contingent on the oppressor's ability to recognize your need. This relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, according to Freire, is an attempt at domestication. But now we're not talking about dogs. We're not talking about animals. We're talking about human beings. So it's the domestication of human beings. And specifically, though Freire doesn't say this, and this is my sort of interpretation, my addition to Freire, this is really what I would classify as the attempt at civilization, so that I would say that civilization and domestication are interchangeable. Look at these primitive indigenous people. They have primitive indigenous practices. Their praxis does not conform to the evolution of society as I see fit. Therefore, I need to civilize this population. I need to change them from their wild ways so that their practice conforms to my praxis, right? And how I do that is I create a sense of dependency, just like I created a sense of dependency in the dog. The dog's wild. I know the dog is foraging for food perpetually. I provide food for the dog on a consistent basis, and by doing so, I create a dependency and oppress the dog. In an international level, it's exactly the same. However, we don't call it domestication, we call it civilization. I civilize these indigenous people. I get them to conform their wild ways. I create a sense of economic dependency on basically the first world experience. And insofar as I create this economic dependency, I now control the population, just like I can control the dog. When I tell the dog to sit, the dog sits. If I'm being attacked and I tell the dog to sit, the dog sits. Because the dog recognizes that if the dog betrays me, it's back in the wild and it has to forage. And it's easy to recognize that it's easier to be provided for than it is to forage. That's the mentality that we need to strip our mind from, right? We need to recognize that it's better to be free than to be contingent on another's provision. This sort of inherent dependency, this ontological dependency, to be technical.